Now, if I were a vehement critic of the Labour Party and I wanted to level an allegation against them that they level against other left-wing political parties and wanted to get under their skin, I would use this one. I would say, are you not engaging in purity politics by not entering into some form of alliance with the Teals and by casting them to the side? I mean, ideologically, they're to the left of centre of the Liberal Party, so it would make sense for you to extend the olive branch to them, but are you saying you are too pure for the Teals? Now, obviously, I would argue that there is no ideological overlap there's no infrastructural ideological overlap. There is, going into the 2022 election, there was common ground certainly on issues of climate change and on the need to have integrity reform that I completely accept. But in terms of broader ideology, I think it's a little bit more loose. But we can work with that as a premise. They have some overlap with ideology. Why don't the two of them nut out a form of alliance? And basically, the thesis of this video that I'm going to argue is that the party machinery, and I alluded to this in the Sloan Zone video I did recently, the party machinery is just as much of a consideration as ideology. And my example for this is by looking at a guy called Billy Trenworth. And if you don't know anything about Victorian Labour history, allow me to give you just the briefest of rundowns on his story. So basically, right, Billy Trenworth was part of a group called the Victorian Trades Hall Committee. This was in the era before a Labour Party existed, and initially it was just basically crowdfunding to sustain strikes and to help workers going on strike. Then eventually towards the end of the 1880s, they're like, maybe we should get one of us to go into Parliament and we should lobby this person, or so you should campaign for this person on the basis of we're going to get working class representation by having a Trades Hall Committee delegate become part of the Victorian Parliament. Billy Trenworth was that guy. And Billy Trenworth's approach to handling this situation was different to what happened in the other states. Now, I want to make it really clear, I am not a critic of Billy Trenworth. This was new territory. It was the brave new world of working class politics, and the approach was not really well, which approach would get the best return wasn't really well known. So it's very easy for me to be wise after the fact. Obviously, Billy Trenworth had no case studies to work with, but we, as beneficiaries of this over a century later, do have case studies to look at, and I think we can learn a lot from them. So there were a number of different approaches amongst the working classes as to how to best achieve their goals. The first one was the much more militant approach, and if you do hear some coughing or some yawning, that is my daughter that is asleep on me right now as she lets out, yeah, there we go, lets out a little bit of a cough there. But there were different approaches. One approach was the very militant one of might equals right. Basically, we will strong arm our employers until they give in to our demands. So they kind of thought getting a Labour Party was pretty pointless. It's just, rather than actually try and get political representation in Parliament and lobby for the laws to be changed, why don't we just go, we're going on strike until you give us what you want, and we should devote all of our resources to sustaining these strikes and taking the war against capital. Then you had the New South Wales approach, which was we should get a organised working class Labour Party and try and get victories in as many electorates as possible, and then we can be the third power. And once we become the third power, we can play the two parties off of each other. We've got the free traders and we've got the protectionists. We can go to them and say, hey, if you want our vote, you've got to give us this. And so it was still a form of strong arming, but it was strong arming in the Parliament rather than in the industrial relations arena. But then you had Billy Trenworth. And Billy Trenworth was like, we just have no chance at getting mass Labour representation in Parliament. The Victorian political divide was different to the New South Wales one. New South Wales was free trade as protectionist. In Victoria, it was the Conservatives versus the Liberals. And so for the Labour Party, okay, there clearly is one government that we can only one option there that we can support. We can't support the Conservatives because the Liberals are at least a little bit more pro-working class and a little bit more pro-industrial relations reform than the Conservatives are. And the most famous example of a Liberal protectionist would be Alfred Deakin. And at that time, his liberalism was emphasised more than his protectionism. And he actually was quite useful in accomplishing some big bits of factory legislation that improved the working conditions in factories throughout the 1880s. However, we have this big strike that happens not long afterwards, and Alfred Deakin plays a key role in suppressing that strike. And so the Labour Party is like, okay, how closely should we align with the Liberals? Do we just view ourselves as a working class extension of the Liberals, or should we try and be a little bit more combative and oppose them? And a lot of the Trades Hall Committee were like, okay, we need to be a separate entity with our own political structure. We can't really work within the Liberals. We're in a position where we could perhaps strong arm them if numbers were favourable in Parliament, but we can't work within the Liberal machinery, which wasn't very well defined at this point. It was a bunch of just independent people going, oh, well, I'm Liberal, you're Liberal, oh, let's vote together. The sophistication of, say, the infrastructure of a Liberal Party didn't exist at that time. Anyway, so Trenwith goes, nah, we've got to be an extension of the Liberal Party. Like, these are our guys. We can't work with the Tories. We need to work with the Liberals. And so in the 1890s, you get a bunch of variations of the Liberals and Labor actually having a shared political party together, which is wild when it later became the battle line in Australian politics. But we had the Progressive Political League, and then literally, look at this, from 1894 to 1896, the United Labor and Liberal Party. And what was very fascinating was that throughout the 1890s, in all of the other key states, there were massive gains that were being made, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, where we actually get a Queensland Premier before the century ends. And then in New South Wales as well, they're flying with guys like James McGowan and William Holman being very influential people in the party that are actually helping make huge electoral ground. And they're able to play the protectionists and the free traders off of each other very effectively and get some huge concessions. In Victoria, they're not getting those. And it becomes quite disastrous. South Australia, by the turn of the, as we go into the 20th century, they're getting better Labor representation. WA flies out of the, the Labor Party doesn't exist in WA until 1899. And then within 5 years, they've got Henry Dalglish, who becomes a Labor Premier for WA. Like, they make ground so much quicker than in Victoria. And there goes my daughter again. In Victoria, they're not able to make any ground. And so by the time we federate, a lot of people that are part of the Trades Hall Committee movement or just the broader Labor movement in Victoria are like, oh my goodness, we have squandered that last decade because we kept trying to wed ourselves to the Liberal Party and we weren't able to get anywhere near as many concessions as what these other states are able to get. We have to really break fellowship with these guys and form our own political movement ASAP. And what ended up happening was pretty much a referendum on the leadership of Billy Trenwith and his leadership of the Labor movement. And so Billy Trenwith ends up becoming a Liberal senator, which is hilarious, right? But it is indicative of the way that the Victorian Labor movement tried to handle the situation. And when you compare it to the other states, they really mishandled the situation by trying to wed themselves to the Liberals. And this isn't a knock on Liberals. Like, they had lots of admirable Liberals from this time period, but the machinery was not one that was geared around increasing the rights of workers and increasing the strength of Labor in the battle between Labor and capital. So anyway, Victoria struggles really badly, but there are some secondary effects that carry on from this. In all of the other Labor parties, they get a taste for government very early on, and they come to appreciate how difficult it is. And the rank and file within the party actually come to understand, okay, like, governing is way harder in practice than it is in theory. And distribution of resources is, again, great to talk about while in opposition, but as soon as you get in there, you realize how difficult it is to properly allocate resources in a way that is politically expedient, that allows for further economic growth, and that actually sees some big and substantial pro-worker reforms that happen as well. So they then get conditioned to almost act as a protest party. You might be surprised to know, if you're not from Victoria, we do not get a majority Labor government. There's a couple of brief minority governments. You got guys like Prendergast and Ned Hogan. Ned Hogan actually aligns with the Nationals or the Country Party at the time. That was pretty funny. But in Victoria, we don't get a majority Labor government until 1952. This is like decades on from every other state. And then they have the 1955 Labor split between the Catholics and the Labor left, secular left at the time. And then that just causes a complete collapse and the Liberals are in for another 2 decades and a half. But when the Labor Party is going about their business throughout the first half of the 20th century, because they hadn't had anything like a tasting in governing, their branches were conditioned to be protest parties. You would go to your branches to basically just have a whinge about how much the government sucked. And that's just how the branches ended up becoming. They were not very constructive for large periods. There's obviously some fantastic talent that came out of the Victorian Labor Party in this time period. But like the structure and the system and the decay crept into those branches where they had some very valid criticisms on the government of the day, but the branches just became a place where you'd complain about the government because they didn't see any prospect of governing themselves, and they didn't have the same pragmatism that those other branches had as well. And again, like you can kind of extrapolate even further from this. When the 1955 Labor split happens, and you get the Victorian Catholics that get effectively booted off the executive, and then they and then they lead a huge exodus away from the party. That leaves the left of the party in power for a very long period of time. And the left of, like the Victorian Labour left, they go on this, almost secular crusade against the Catholics where they refuse to give, like WA did as well, refused to give a lot of concessions that were easy cannon fodder to give to Catholics to show we want you back, we want you to be back in the party, but they wanted to punish the Catholics that had left the Labour Party in huge droves, and that just led to them being completely electorally unelectable until Gough Whitlam actually did an intervention on the party and goes, "Nah, guys, no, we need to have a stronger right representation, and you need to be way more pragmatic, and you need to just come on, just get the Catholics back on side." And so that lasted up until Gough Whitlam, and then a decade later, they end up getting government with John Cain Jr. Now, the point that I want to make here is the fact that ideological overlap is not really that much of a basis for any long-term agreement. It can, get you through a shortfall, like if you have to form a minority government with one or two independents, or, as in Gard's case, you did it with the Greens. That can allow you to hit a couple of short-term policy objectives, but it's not at all stable grounds for having any long-term prospect. Even amongst the coalition, it was as stable as you could get it for a long period of time. We're now seeing the fragility of that come to light, as we have seen in numerous other instances with like the Joe for PM campaign and a couple of other instances where we've seen these big splits with John McEwen strong-arming the Liberals into not having Billy McVarm be the Prime Minister. There's a couple of other these instances where it proves to be really unstable. So, the point that I want to exaggerate here, or emphasize, that sounds like I'm mischaracterizing. The point that I want to emphasize here is that party machinery is either as important, possibly more important. You can make that assessment what you will. But when you're talking about alliances and who has what in common with who, we're not just talking about ideology here. We are talking about machinery. Billy Trenwith was right to identify that the Liberals were closer in ideology to the Labour Party than the Conservatives were. Obviously, that is a true statement. But then he wedded the two machineries together and it didn't work because the Labour Party is a party that has unions get a big say. We have union affiliation. We have unions at the policy table. In the Liberal Party, that obviously doesn't exist. And we saw this clash of machinery, I should say, that held the Labour Party back in Victoria for such a long period of time. Even like for Graham Richardson, whatever, when he tried, like both Paul Keating and Graham Richardson tried to get Malcolm Turnbull to join the Labour Party in the 1990s after he let his Liberal membership lapse. Turnbull vehemently denies he had a meeting with Richardson, but I actually got given some interesting sources that seem to indicate that actually isn't all that believable. But anyway, that's not the point that I'm trying to make here. If you have Turnbull bound, like he was just, get him in as a senator. If you have Turnbull, who at that point was a political free agent, a hired gun, clearly wanted to be a significant person in politics, but hadn't chosen his political allegiance at that point. If you get him bound by the Labour Party structure, that is going, like, you can harness his effectiveness far more, and at the same time, he just becomes much less of a liability. And Graham Richardson didn't just want Malcolm Turnbull to be an independent who could be relied upon, or a Labour sympathetic independent. He wanted Malcolm Turnbull bound by the Labour Party and bound by the structure. And so I really do want to emphasize this when we are thinking about who should, like, political marriages, political alliances. Ideology is just the surface level part of the conversation. Machinery is far more important. And if you look at the machinery issue, like, Teals are liberals, right? I don't mean liberals as in party. I mean smaller liberals. Classic, like, social progressivism, but from affluent areas, and tend to have a worldview of, if people just adopt my outlook on things, the world will be a better place. That tends to be how small L liberals tend to operate in parliament, in politics. When you look at someone like the Labour Party, it's not necessarily the world needs to have my, like, the country needs to have my worldview. It's there are material benefits on the line here that I think we can extract by emphasizing the struggle of our particular class or our particular group of people. And then there's the spectrums from how ideological people are about that to how pragmatic people are about that. But it's a machinery that binds the party less so than an ideology. And so when it comes to a marriage between small L Liberals and Labour, we've tried it before and it didn't work, and it had terrible consequences for the party in Victoria. So no, should the Teals and Labour not out of formal alliance, even if we have an electoral circumstance that is far closer, a short-term alliance, possibly, sure, for short-term priorities, but for anything like long-term or trying to resemble the pact that the Liberals and Nationals have had for such a long period of time, I think the historical precedent tends to show that it leads to bad decline for the Labour Party and doesn't deal with the machinery issue. The academy is currently on pause right now in terms of new applicants and new entries because we are revamping and adding in some extra state modules to expand the scope of the academy. But that being said, if you just put your name down, that's not an obligation to join. And you'll be the first people I get in contact with when new spots open up. The April spots sold out quite quickly. Like we've been sold out for a week now and the month still isn't over. So get your name down if you are interested. There's no obligation to join. And you'll be the first people that I contact once the academy reopens again.